What's up, guys? What's going on, man? I'm Paul. This is Pauline Theology's Daily Devotional, and we are finishing the chapter 9 of John. We're on John chapter 9, 39 through 41. So go ahead and check it out, read what it has to say, come back, and we'll answer the 4 questions. If you've already read it, then we're going to go ahead and jump in, man. Why wait, man, when we are studying the good scriptures, the words of Jesus and the divine word of God. So what's going on, man? What's happening in chapter 9, verse 39 through 41? Well, we're coming to that conclusion of that pericope where Jesus has has made the blind man see. And then the blind man believes and worships Jesus. And now Jesus has some words to say after that. He says he comes in this world for judgment, that the blind might see and those who see might become blind. He said that's a confusing statement. He's like, I come to let the blind see and the see becoming blind. But the Pharisees heard this, man, and they asked the question, are we blind? And then Jesus answers and says that if you're blind, then your sin is you have no sin. But because you say you see, your sin remains. So what does all that mean? Yeah, so I guess first off, we'll see that Jesus came in to do something truly miraculous by causing the blind to see. That's the first thing that happens, is that the actual physical reality. But oftentimes we see in this Johannine writings is that there's a double level. And this double level is a spiritual level, of course. It's because most of the things that Jesus speaks about, he speaks on a spiritual level. And then the people who he talks about always comprehend it on a physical level. And so when he says that they're coming to see, or he's coming to cause the blind to see, the spiritually blind, those who feel that they don't know what's going on and they can't figure it out, or they don't have it all together, that's who Jesus has come to save. He came to cause them people to see. But then he says those who think they see. So those who think that they know what's going on, how everything is supposed to be, and don't recognize him. Because there's a difference, man. When you recognize him, the first one applies. But whenever you think you're doing it on your own, that by your own strength, you're supporting yourself, pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps, that means you're not seeing. You think you see, but you're not seeing. And so the Pharisees heard this and they asked that question. And that's why Jesus has most likely probably even said this question or said these things, is because they think that they know. Earlier, they talked about being disciples of Moses and not disciples of Jesus. But Jesus said earlier that Moses spoke about me. And so in their seeing, they think that they recognize and know the scriptures and understand it. But when they don't recognize Jesus, then they are truly blind. And the final part is the one that is most amazing, is that he forgives sins. So he says those who are blind are without sin. And the reason he says that is because their sins are not, the judgment of their sin is not passed upon them. Because that's what Jesus says he came to do. He came to judge. Now, I know, quick little reference back to what that talks about earlier when it says, I didn't come in this world to judge. But consequently, from saving, which is primary purpose, judgment happens, condemnation happens, because those who do not seek or do not look for, do not come to Jesus, are by consequence judged, condemned. And so in the same way is what Jesus is kind of saying when he says that if you're blind, your sin doesn't remain. It means the judgment, which is deservedly ours, does not come upon us, because he's the Lamb that takes away the sins of the world. But because you see, because you think that you can handle it on your own, your sin remains. And remember, remains is an important word here. And this remaining is the complete opposite of the remaining that Jesus is looking for in us. As we remain in him and we find our fuel and our source, our home, our life, our dwelling in him, then we find life and we are forgiven of sins and we are made restored to the fellowship of God that Adam enjoyed in the very beginning. But when you remain in your sin, all of that is opposite. Condemnation, separation, and desperation. So what does this say about God? Well, God is the one who is able. Who can cause the blind to see? Who can make a man born blind that has never happened before? God can. He is able. But not only is he able to cure us of our earthly or physical remedies. So for those out there that are deeply troubled or in problems for physical ailments, man, God can use those to bring glory to his name first off, because that's what the blind man's story is about, is that through the suffering of his ailment, Jesus was glorified. Now, it may not always end in a miraculous healing like this one, but God is glorified as his saints suffer, because it shows the goodness of God and the remaining, how we follow him despite, and then just the nature of who Jesus is. It's tough to believe sometimes, but as we see it, we trust him more. Those are the reasons why we go through these things, is because we find more trust and more a foundation of hope in him through these. But that also, the suffering that we go through, which I say is for the glory of God, it's also whenever he uses a spiritual element to open our eyes to see. His name is glorified. When we see him and we find the connection, we find that relationship, that life in his name, he is glorified. So he is able to physically change, but he's also spiritually. And that's the one thing that we need to seek the most, is that spiritual change. As God comes in us and makes us new, and we live in him and find hope and a peace that's everlasting. What's this say about man? Is that, man, we've got to recognize that we're sinful before we can be saved. We've got to recognize that we're in trouble before we can find the solution. We got to know that we have a problem. And so we have to recognize that. But number two, I think it's also a fact of an application to it, which I guess I should just go on application. But we have to recognize that, and then we have to help others to recognize that. And that's a hard part right there. That's when that boldness comes in again. It's to being able to share the gospel. They got to know the bad news before the good news. And so that's why it's imperative. That's why it's important for us to mention sin. Because without recognizing our sin, we will remain in it. We will remain in it. So how do we apply these truths to our lives? Well, do you recognize your inability? We have to recognize our inability to save ourselves. We have to recognize that we can't see. We are blind. And when we recognize that, that's when salvation happens. So look in your life today, examine it, see what's going on, and see where we need, in every aspect, but where we need Jesus, where we need to be humbled so that we might be exalted. Hey, I appreciate you guys for listening, and I will see you in the next episode.